Standard in Baltimore last weekend on the SCG Tour was won by Jim Davis playing Bant Company. But we saw a lot of humans decks, we saw a lot of white-black mid-range Eldrazi decks, we saw a lot of different things. It's hard to kind of guess what people are going to do here for the second week of this format, but I think a pretty safe place to start, and given what I've seen for this week, Patrick, is humans is pretty safe. You've got Always Watching, you've got different versions, you can be mono-white, you can splash blue for Reflector Mage, of course you can splash green for Dromoka's Command, Tireless Tracker. What do we think about this deck?
Well, I think it's definitely going to be the most popular deck if you add all those different builds of the deck together. It's very rare to see a deck that not only has the best critical mass of cheap creatures and a lot of good tribal synergies, which the human deck does, but also arguably the best removal in the format. There's a premium right now on exiling, being able to interact at instant speed, and the white removal does that better than any other color. You add that up with the fact that the splashes is a pretty low opportunity cost, the battle lands and the shadow lands alongside White of the Night Orchid makes it fairly easy to add either green or blue to the deck if you want to. Although it was telling that the second place deck, the best performer last weekend, was just straight white. In any case, I expect to see a lot of white humans over the weekend.
Ryan, how do you feel about it?
Yeah, so that's the other thing about the deck, not only very generically powerful with Declaration in Stone and Always Watching, but that customizability is really interesting. You have questions like, do I want to play Archangel of Ties or Griff's Boon, which is like a really oddball question. Last weekend we saw Griff's Boon perform better. I kind of expect that to carry open into this weekend. I think that card was really underrated going into Standard, and I'm excited to see how many copies people play. I think you might even go up to 4 copies of that card, potentially.
Matthias, for you, I know you don't like to attack.
Yeah, you know, I know you have to talk about this right now. We have this mono-white humans deck, and it's the talk of the town. Everyone's saying they're going to play it this weekend. I refuse to believe that the best deck in Standard right now is 4 Dragon Hunters. Okay, that is such an easy creature to kill, and I want to be on the side of kill spells for it. Now, I do think the deck's powerful and it's going to get its due because of that. But if I were looking to play this deck, I want to have bigger, I want to have better cards. I like a lot of players who are going toward the green versions of this deck. Like, let's play Dromoka's Command. If someone's going to play Always Watching or Stasis Snare, let's make them sacrifice it. Let's kill the creatures as opposed to just trying to play Griff's Boon and only one color and only planes.
Yeah, clearly you're not ever going to play this deck.
Absolutely
This is not you. Now, maybe this deck is a little bit more your speed, but Ryan, we'll start with you on the Collected Company deck that Jim won with last weekend. Bant Company seems to be the Collected Company deck of choice. Of course, you've got the card Collected Company, which is stay through rotation. You've got Sylvan Advocate, you've got Jace, Archangel Avacyn. You can kind of season the taste how you want to. How do you feel about this deck for the weekend?
Yeah, so Collected Company is just a fantastic Magic card. It's seen tons of play in both Standard and Modern alike. The 2 strengths of the card are both the mana efficiency, the ability to make 6 mana worth of permanents for only 4 mana, and doing that at instant speed. And that's something that Jim's deck took advantage of, was both of these strengths, trying to play that flash game and get ahead on mana. Also doing that with Duskwatch Recruiter was another card that can generate mana for casting your spells and playing at instant speed. Jace Vryn's Prodigy, not as powerful as it was with fetch lands in the format. He's actually been talking about trimming on Jace in the deck, which is interesting, maybe going down to 3 or 2 copies, but it still has even the ability to flashback Collected Company. A lot of raw power in this deck. I expect it to have another good weekend. There's some customizability in the 2 drops, so there's not really exciting options. Sylvan Advocate being a 2/3 is actually really good against humans, but you don't really bring a ton more value in the deck, but it's certainly better than Elvish Visionary, which is kind of your other option.
So for Matthias, I'll ask you, because you get to kind of play at instant speed, things of that nature, which is more the game I think you like to play. This is the deck that's got kind of the bullseye on it for the weekend. So, are you coming in worried about this deck? Do you think it can customize itself to be ready to go?
Well, what I like about this deck is its fallback plan is it's just full of really good cards. Ryan talked on this. A great Collected Company is one that hits 2 3-drops. It hits 6 mana worth of great creatures, and this deck's going to do that all the time. Sure, there's going to be a bullseye on it, but if you looked at Bant Company, even from last season, that deck did pretty well for most of the season, and I don't think control decks are at the point where they're going to hate this out of the format. It's going to have its bullseye on it, and I think it'll still do well even with the bullseye.
For Patrick, people are talking about shaving Jace. You've got a 3-color mana base, which worked really well for Jim last weekend. Not sure if that's going to be the case this weekend, but I think Jace is one of the ways that actually makes the mana base work, so can you see shaving on that card?
I can see shaving on it. There aren't the same level of spells to flashback in this build as previous Collected Company decks. On top of that, as Ryan mentioned, without the fetch lands, it's just flipping less reliably. So I could see shaving down on this card. I would be surprised for it to be cut entirely from the deck. There's just a lot of raw power there. But the mana coming into play untapped is not as smooth as it was in the previous format. That combined with the fact that there's just fewer spells to flash back, and if you went down to 3 Jaces or even 2 Jaces, I wouldn't be surprised.
Okay, that gives you an idea of Bant Company. We know it's going to be represented here along with humans. And the third deck that had a real breakout performance in the hands of Todd Anderson last weekend was, of course, Blue-Red Control. He had some insane turns in Baltimore, if you got to watch the coverage last weekend. All of them revolved around Pyromancer's Goggles, some transformation of Thing in the Ice, and then Chandra Flamecaller, maybe the most powerful planeswalker in the format. this may be more your speed.
Yeah, well, this is really interesting that we've gone to this 2-color control deck in the format. So last season, we saw Jeskai Black as your go-to control deck. I think between Dig Through Time, Treasure Cruise, and Painful Truths plus a mana base, I kind of had this thing going where if you wanted extra cards, you could just have them. It wasn't very hard to do. Now that we've moved away from perfect mana, decks are actually having to work for their card advantage, and I think Todd's done it in a really interesting way with a card like Pyromancer's Goggles. I mean, this card saw no play up until this season, but combining with Magmatic Insight and Tormenting Voice actually is a pretty good card advantage engine, and one that I expect to see going forward. This deck uses it pretty well.
Ryan, what do you think about the power level of this deck? I mean, it's got some really busted turns. You're kind of on card parity. Tormenting Voice, discard a card, draw 2 cards. That's 2 for 2. You're not really getting that far ahead of your opponent, but as a control deck in a general sense, I think this is really kind of the only way you can do it for this weekend.
Yeah, I definitely agree. The deck is very reminiscent of the Sphinx's Tourlish deck, I guess 2 standards ago now. The win condition, when it's spinning its tires, it looks really bad when you're just casting Tormenting Voice and drawing lands. It's not the best cantrip that we've ever seen in standard, certainly, and losing Treasure Cruise hurts a lot, but when the deck's actually firing, when you have the goggles going and you're drawing 5 cards a turn, you're going to find something. And I think that this deck is actually really well positioned, and I've seen some discussion of going to mono red. I don't know if that's necessarily correct. Thinking the ice actually looked really good on camera, but I do think that Goggles specifically is going to be very well positioned this weekend.
Your thoughts on this deck kind of in a general sense, Patrick?
I like it for this weekend. I think Matthias brought up a very good point about what's happened with the card advantage in the format. Even if you go back to the previous standard format, the beatdown decks had access to cards like Den Protector, Death Misraptor, and Obsong Charm. They could hang around in a card advantage game for a very long time. So it was important for the control decks to find trumps. That was the way they had to win the game. Now, with less card advantage floating around, just generating a couple 2-for-1s and answering the board, that's going to be a way for a control deck to win in this format. So I think the blue-red deck can do that reliably enough and can interact with enough different permanents reliably enough that's going to be an effective control deck for the weekend.
I think this will be the control deck that people select. Now, there are some other options that you can go with, and we'll get to that in just a moment, but this looks to be, because of Todd's performance, I think people are going to go this direction. Now, one deck that we saw a little bit of last weekend from Harlan Fear was kind of a black-green tokens deck with Cryptolite Rift, with Cryptolith Right, pardon me, Catacomb Sifter, Westvale Abbey, trying to cast Ulamogs and do some insane things. Now, in our pre-game meeting, Matthias says, I want to talk about this deck, so you get to talk about this deck. There were moments where Harlan had some pretty flashy turns. Other times it looked pretty bad, so you want to shotgun this, so take it away.
All right, so I don't want to play fair Magic very much, and this is, I think, one of the best ways to break through it. We don't have the right build of it yet, so I'm not sure if it's ready to make a breakout at this tournament, but there is a build of it. I mean, what this card does by making all your creatures into birds of paradise, more or less, is it gives you a game plan along cards like Catacomb Sifter and Blister Pod to kind of play this rally game plan where you just like chump block your way until you play a really large spell. Now, we're still waiting, we've seen some lists of Zendikar Resurgent, Atarka. These are cards, we don't really have the finisher for the deck yet, so I still think this is a work in progress, but there's a lot of raw power in the card like Cryptolith Right, and I wouldn't be surprised if one of our teams has come up with a good build for it. I don't think it's going to take very much for this kind of strategy to be very good against, say, the white humans decks of the format.
Feels like a combo deck to me, Ryan, for this particular weekend that's hard to build. Would you try to sleeve something up like this for this tournament this weekend?
If I had no day job and was able to just jam games of Magic all the time, this is something I might be able to figure out.
Okay.
That's very far from my reality. I would probably play something closer to a stock list, but if you have the time and this is kind of your forte, then I think that there's some really interesting and powerful space to explore. Zendikar Resurgent in play, very difficult to answer for most decks, and you can actually generate more value than Pyromancer's Goggles, and if I think that card is great, then this card has to also be great.
Okay, I mean, it's definitely tough to build. It's a real risk. If someone has it, they probably have a good weekend, Patrick.
Well, my apprehension would be, after seeing what happened last weekend with all the white decks and always watching in Stasis Snare, I think that people are going to have more enchantment removal kind of as a baseline thing than they might have had last week. So I would be very concerned about building around a linchpin enchantment like this deck does. The payoff's definitely there.
Okay.
I mean, when you're humming, this is the most powerful thing or among the most powerful things to do in Standard, but I would be very concerned about leaning too heavily on enchantments for this tournament.
And now there is one final kind of deck that we're going to group this all in. Enter black-based control decks. That means we're talking about Language, which is basically your Wrath of God mass removal-esque effect in the format. It can be very good at times, it can be kind of bad at times. Sylvan Advocate, of course, when there are 6 lands, is a 4/5, not a 4/4. So in these Language decks, you can go a lot of different ways. White-black mid-range, white-black control, white-black Eldrazi, Of course, there is Esper Dragon, so we're talking Declaration in Stone, we're talking Sorin in these decks probably, Dragon Lineage, stuff like that. I know you're a pretty big fan of Languish coming in this tournament. How do you want to approach this?
Well, the problem is that week one, it's very hard to build control decks. And you don't know, is the enemy going to be mono white humans? Is it going to be some sort of Eldrazi deck? It's very hard to find the right answers. The week one results in Baltimore were pretty decisive. You know what the targets are now, and I think that a deck with Languish, which has to be excellent against the mono white humans deck, very few creatures, so you avoid things like Stasis Snare and Reflector Mage, and a lot of Planeswalkers, which these decks don't interact with that reliably. I think there could be a base there. I don't know if it's in a black-white shell, I don't know if it's Esper, but I have to believe that Languish and Planeswalkers will be in some sort of successful deck this weekend.
We're talking creatureless control here, basically, Ryan. Is that kind of what you like to do?
Absolutely.
Okay.
When you can sweep everything up, when Languish can be like a 4-for-1, I'm right at home right there. And especially what Patrick was saying, it's super difficult to build a control deck that's very good week one, and that's a big reason why you saw the Roanoke crew bias towards playing Eldrazi. They had a proactive game plan, but now in week two, even that deck, if you cast Thought-Knot Seer and you have a Displacer and I cast Languish, I kill your 2 creatures and I draw a card. That seems like a very good position, and I think that we could see a Languish deck go very far in this tournament.
It's a control deck with no blue cards, maybe.
Right. I mean,
Matthias.
it's a black-white mid-range deck, which we're talking about here. And I agree with Patrick that you can build a deck to beat mono-white right now. Languish is going to be a really excellent card to do that. My concern right now with that strategy is it's going to be hard to beat the mono-white decks of the format and to beat the Pyromancer's Goggles decks of the format at the same time. These blue-red tempo instant decks are generally very good against your 3-4 drop mid-rangey control decks. So yeah, you can have this deck, and I think we will see some of it, and it'll be good against a lot of the format, but you're going to be having a lot of admitted weakness, which isn't always where I want to be with a control deck.
Well, that gives